Hi, everybody. I'm Dan Hertz from the College of Pharmacy, and I'm here to tell you a little bit about our project around monitoring chemotherapy-induced peripheral neuropathy via NeuroDetect. So I know that a lot of you aren't from the oncology world, so I'm going to tell you a little bit about chemo-induced peripheral neuropathy. This is a very common side effect of several of the most commonly used cancer chemotherapy drugs. It appears as numbness or tingling in the fingers and toes. That can lead to loss of sensation, loss of function, inability to walk, to balance, to manipulate objects, to clothe yourself, to dress yourself. It is also irreversible in a lot of patients, so it can lead to long-term increases in falls, loss of functional ability, decreased quality of life, inability to work, lots of really bad downstream consequences of chemo-induced peripheral neuropathy. Importantly, this side effect is not predictable, preventable, or treatable. So most patients who start experiencing severe neuropathy have to discontinue treatment early, so they're not receiving active cancer treatment. In clinical practice, usually this is graded by clinicians on a very basic 0 to 4 scale. In the past decade or so, there's been advancements in using patient-reported outcome surveys. So that's being used in more clinical trials and clinical practice. But there are limitations to these approaches. We know that some patients don't want to tell their clinicians about their side effects because they don't want their treatment to be changed. And there's no objective component. So we're looking to find a way that we could build something that would allow for objective assessment of CIPN and maybe find early indications of sort of subclinical peripheral neuropathy. So that's when we started building NeuroDetect. Our first generation just included some of these patient-reported outcome and surveys that you see on the left-hand side, and 2 very simple assessments that you see on the right-hand side, a natural walk and the hole and peg test that are in Apple's research kit. We did a cross-sectional study in patients who had already received and completed neurotoxic chemotherapy. So there were 16 patients with neuropathy, 10 patients without neuropathy. We had them each do our objective functional assessments one time, and we saw that the patients with neuropathy had evidence of shorter step lengths and unique swaying patterns as they were walking. So it gave us some indication that there might be something that could be done here where we're using objective assessment on a phone to identify peripheral neuropathy. So that led us to get some funding and create NeuroDetect version 2.0 that had more objective assessments. So in addition to natural walk, we have patients do a tandem walk, which is sort of one foot directly in front of the other, like a field sobriety test, a tandem stance, a Romberg stance where they stand still with their eyes open and then closed. It's a very common neurological assessment that's used. And then 2 manual dexterity tasks, one with this finger tapping 100 times, so it's sort of a manual strength task, and then also the hole and peg test. Here's just an example of what it looks like. So the patient does this on their own, in their home, whenever it's convenient for them. The app tells them, here are the instructions, here's what you're supposed to do, and then walks them through this while the app is in their pocket or in their hands. So this time we did an observational longitudinal study. We enrolled and consented 68 patients. They completed NeuroDetect before the start of each monthly cycle. And then 45 of those patients did a clinical assessment with a neurologist at the end of treatment. So there was 45 of those patients that we have detailed clinical neurological testing. You can see here on the right-hand side some of the aspects of that patient population. It's a pretty standard breast cancer patient population. So I would like to thank the person in the upper right-hand corner, my very talented postdoc at the time, Chelsea Chen. She was able to wrangle and analyze all this data. This apparently is what this data looked like, at least to her. I can't tell you very much more about what the data looks like or how it was analyzed. Here are some of the quantitative metrics that she was able to generate. So almost 4,000 quantitative metrics from these 7 assessments. You can see that some of these assessments had very few quantitative measures. Some had more than 1,000. She did some really comprehensive, contemporary, advanced machine learning analyses and created a CIPN prediction algorithm. So that's where I can jump in. So on the left-hand side here, this is one of the main figures. So the patients here from 1 to 60 are ordered in descending order of the confidence of our algorithm in them having experienced CIPN. So you can see these patients where the algorithm is very confident they experienced CIPN. These are all in red. These are actually the patients who did experience CIPN. You can see down here all the patients who the algorithm was confident they did not experience CIPN. For the most part, those patients did not. There's one red dot here. I don't know if you guys can see that well from where you're sitting. So very strong predictive performance. But again, this of course was used in the population in which the algorithm was developed. So we're still sort of in early stages. We also looked at whether the NeuroDetect app gave you earlier information rather than just a patient-reported survey. We found some information that the app was better much earlier in treatment, although over time they were equally effective because at some point in treatment, a patient can just tell you, I'm experiencing neuropathy. Okay, so in summary, we have preliminary evidence that we're very excited about that NeuroDetect may improve CIPN detection. We have an observational study of 1,000 patients that we are hoping to validate our CIPN detection algorithm in. Our R01 was submitted last year. It is supposed to be reviewed in the next 2 days. And if the government stays open, maybe we'll find out how it was scored next week. We think there are opportunities here for AI and machine learning analysis in the areas of TIPN monitoring and prediction. We're hoping in the future we can do prospective clinical trials where you're using NeuroDetect to find CIPN earlier in treatment and then allowing patients to use that to make shared decision-making about how best to move forward with their treatment. Thank you very much. I'll hand it off to the next speaker.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me today, and thank you, Kathy, for a nice introduction. So I'm a quantitative scientist developing statistical and machine learning methods, and I work with a lot of types of wearables data, but continuous glucose monitors is what is my primary area of expertise. So I organize this a little bit like a tutorial for those of you who may not be familiar with the technology, but also if you are familiar, I hope you would learn something new as well. So CGMs, very small wearable devices, and Gabriel over there should have at least a couple of them that you can look up closely. They measure your interstitial glucose levels. Typical measurement frequency is 5 minutes. Once you put one on, you usually wear it for around 14 days, and then you have to discharge it and then put a new one on if you want to. So where is it used and where it may be helpful for your research? So a lot of people with diabetes already wear one to help them inform the insulin administration and other behavioral choices, such as what kind of meal they may have, whether they should go for an exercise. And when people with diabetes who wear CGM come to see their doctor and endocrinologist, they may look at that signal to decide to adjust the treatment or make recommendations for what changes they should do. Of course, in clinical trials, it's increasingly common to use CGM-based endpoints to evaluate treatment efficacy and research at large. So we have seen several posters, including from my group, where CGM is used to look at associations between other clinical outcomes. We can study nutrition based on the glucose response measured by CGM. And of course, we can do interventions, just-in-time interventions as well, and many other things. So this is just to give you a perspective. This is data from 5 individuals who have type 2 diabetes. They actually have mild to moderate sleep apnea as well. And they don't take insulin. So you can see that the glucose levels run pretty high. The red lines indicate standard time in range, 70 to 180. But you also see things like you can have gaps of missing data. Sometimes they're larger, sometimes they could be smaller. And if you don't have information about what these people do, it's really difficult to think how to think of this data because you don't know what the peaks correspond to necessarily. So the third question is, how much, sorry, this got rumbled up for some reason. But the first question you may ask is, how much data do you need? And typically you need, the recommendations, the consensus guidelines are 14 weeks of data that are at least 70% complete. And this is really a convenience because one CGM device typically you can wear for 14 days, so you can obtain it with just one device applications. If your goal is to really measure long-term glycemic exposure, like 90 days corresponding to standard HbA1c biomarker, then we show you risk to underpower your studies. And if you want to learn more, there is a poster over there by Neo over here that shows you the statistical analysis and our recommendation to really aim for 30 days or 2 CGMs, one after another, if you want to detect some smaller effects and not underpower your study as much. The second thing you may need to be aware of if you work with CGM data with research data warehouses is that it's not curated. And whenever you upload anything on the cloud, weird things may happen. So you sometimes have repeated device uploads, time shifts. And what we found within Michigan Medicine Research Data Warehouse, you have this overlapping duplicated profiles. So if you try to complete the metrics on that right away, you would not be accurate. So we have developed an algorithm to correct for that, but that's something you have to keep in mind as the data gets larger and larger and less curated. I'm really sorry, I don't know what happened. I think I transitioned my presentation from PDF to PowerPoint, so it got a little overlaid, so I apologize again. But once you have your clean data signal and you have enough of the CGM data, there is some standard metrics that you typically compute, such as time and range. If you don't know where to start with that one. That's the most accepted one, which is a percentage of time within 70 to 180. And there's usually a lot of different other consensus metrics that you can compute. We have an open source R package iClue. It's freely available. We have lots of tutorials. It can compute all of the consensus metrics and more. It can visualize your data. So if this is something that you are new to or just want to expand your metric list, this is the source I will send you to. And of course, if you're within Michigan Medicine, I also wanted to make you aware that we already did the work for you. So all of those metrics are pre-computed, the data is processed, duplication is addressed, and that was collaboration with Joyce Lee at Caswell Diabetes Institute. So if you're interested in retrospective CGM data from Michigan Medicine patients, you can utilize CDA informatics resources, and then you don't have to think of this metrics computation yourself. We can go further than the metrics. There's a shift within the field. There's a recent paper called CGM Data Analysis 2.0, and I just wanted to do some of the highlights of that paper and also the work we did within our group. So one of the things is that we are sort of using this fixed glucose thresholds, 70 and 180. They're informed by type 1 diabetes populations, but there's generally recognition within the field that those are not a universal threshold. Sometimes we do time in tight range, which is 70 to 140. We have pregnant population. We have a population with type 2 diabetes. We have a population with prediabetes. So another poster over here, if you haven't seen, has been our recent work on how to do adaptive data-driven thresholds. And for those of you who are not working with CGM, but working with activity, that may also be of interest, because the ideas generalize what are the thresholds you should do for moderate or vigorous or high activity. That could be data adaptive as well. There's a lot of interest in alignment, the data temporal alignment. In the context of CGM, we can align the data by periods of sleep, for instance, or by the meal times, and that can give us a little bit more information about the temporal changes. Or we can look at the whole distribution of glucose values that is threshold independent and has been coined glucodensity in the CGM literature. So I think the future is bright, and if you're just starting, again, the checklist is visualize your data, make sure that you don't have duplication, especially if it's a large-scale data from the cloud that has not been curated. Ensure you have enough data. We recommend 30 days to make sure your studies are not underpowered. Start with a consensus if you don't know where to start, but look at the expanded metric list, depending on the study and research questions of interest that may help. And then just know that the field is evolving. There's a lot of changes, temporal alignment, distributional alignment, the use of AI, especially in the context of glucose forecasting. We work on all of these areas within our group, and I'll be happy to talk more with any of you. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Lauro Ojeda, and I work in the Mechanical Engineering Department. My specialty is inertial sensors, and I've been doing a lot of gait analysis for many years, and I'm going to try to convince you that gait is yet another sensor that you should be considering for your applications. Here, so I have some external disclosures, and I will not be talking about any of these during this talk. Now, why gait matters? Now, sometimes gait is the first thing that you observe. For example, if somebody suffers of a stroke, then gait is the first thing that gets affected. Sometimes gait is what you can start observing when a disease begins, for example, for Parkinson or ALS. But gait also affects if you change your mood. And I don't know about you, but I can tell when my son has a bad day, I can see him dragging the feet in the afternoon. And so, but definitely there are better examples. Now, how do we do this? What we have been doing is we mount or we attach these sensors to the shoe or to the feet of the person. And then we use inertial sensors, which are basically accelerometers and gyroscopes. And we use that to calculate three-dimensional foot location and orientation. So we know exactly how the foot moves in three-dimensional space. We know how close it comes against the ground on every step. And stepping is very complex. So during stepping, the person actually tilts the foot and goes around the other foot in order to advance. Now, why is this important? Because if you have a sequence of steps, then what happens is that you can start doing statistical analysis with every single step. Then you want to know whether the person has a certain stride length and certain distribution, because you want to be more or less stable and not unstable or very variable, because it may indicate that you have some problems of balance. Now, based on that, then the information goes back to the doctor, it goes back to the caregiver, or to an AI system, where then somebody has to make a decision. You have to change your medicine, you have to change maybe the amount of rehabilitation that you have to do, or something has to change. And then whatever you do, it affects gait again, and then you close this loop. So the idea is that you use gait as a metric that will help you guide your treatment. Now, gait can be used as a functional biomarker. Now, many things affect gait. And for example, there is this study that we ran on patients that have retinitis pigmentosa. So they basically have tunnel vision. So if you put your hands in front of your eyes, that's how much they can see. Now, by having them just walking and following a straight path, we start seeing that they are more variable than normal. On blue, we have the patients, and in red, we have control. So they have to do a lot more adjustments on every step. And also, they have to do a lot more corrections, lateral corrections, because they tend to walk towards one side, and then they have to correct. Now, walking straight is important for many conditions, but not for all of them. For example, for Parkinson's, some Parkinson patients, they walk as normal as us, and sometimes they can walk very fast. So just moving straight doesn't matter, but turning matters. And we had a group of patients just doing 360-degree turns, and then we started measuring how long does it take for them to complete the turn. When compared to control, they tend to do the turning slower, and significantly slower than the control group. Now, that not even considering if they have a freezing of gait event, because then it will take a lot longer. So this is just normal turning for Parkinson patients. Now, what is interesting about this method is that you can use it anywhere and anytime. So we are not confined now to a lab, so you just have to wear one of these sensors, mount it on your foot, and then you are ready to start getting gait information. And the other interesting thing is that anyone can use it, including the subject or the participant itself. So during COVID, we started trying to do some of the tests that people do normally in the clinic. We wanted them to do at home. And the easiest one was, well, if there is a test that the doctors run in the clinic, what happens if they run it exactly the same thing at home? So we had a group of participants that have glaucoma, and they first came to the clinic, they ran the test, it was a speed test, just knowing how fast they walk in a straight corridor. And then they had to do exactly the same thing at home. Now, the first thing is, it's hard to tell here, but that's 45 participants. But what is important is that, as you may have guessed, people in the clinic, they walk a lot faster. So nobody wants to show the weak side to the doctor. But at home, that's a different thing, because then you tend to walk normally. Now, one interesting thing about wearables is that you can wear them all day, and then you can start wearing them for just quantifying what you do in real world. And real world is not a straight walk. It's not even a flat walk. It can look something like that. That's one of the buildings in the College of Engineering. And that what you see on the right is an animation of one of these sensors just mounted on the foot as the person is walking in the building. So with the techniques that we have developed, we can really track the person in three-dimensional space, and we can tell exactly what's happened during a normal day of a person. The important information is that, well, what happens if you collect a whole day of data? What can you find about a person? What you see here is 1 day of a participant. And what I am showing is the elevation against forward displacement. You may notice that the red stripes are shorter than the blue ones. Blue is the beginning of the day of the person, and red is by the end of the day. And the steps that go up, those are the few steps that the person maybe did walk upstairs, and then the other ones are when the person was walking downstairs. Now, this is an overview of the strides, and then you see some of the strides going to the left, because people do turn to the left and also to the right. Now, as I indicated at the beginning, Gait enables early detection. For example, Parkinson, I mean, that's one of the first things that they observe. And ALS is another one. And also, it allows for personalized interventions. Now, some of the interventions cannot be done immediately. So it's not that you can get information and then say, well, let's fix it or let's correct it. So we have this group of participants that have diabetic neuropathy, and we wanted to evaluate how well they will perform if they go from the normal shoes to the orthotic shoe. Now, you cannot just swap the shoes and then test them, because probably they will work very bad immediately. It takes a week before they get use of that. So after a week of testing, this is what we observed. So what you see there is 1 week of walking. In the bluish color, that is their normal shoes. That's before the treatment, before the intervention. And then in the red color is after the intervention. Now, the number of steps have increased, and that's important. But the other important thing is that the average speed, the average stride length has increased as well. So they are doing longer steps because they have less pain. So I think that concludes my talk, and I just wanted to give you an idea of how we evolved to here. Okay, so from the first IMU, the first system weighted as much as 4 pounds. That's a brick size. And now the latest ones they weigh the equivalent of a quarter. Okay.
Howdy, folks. Thank you. So I was going to talk a little bit today about a paper we have, but more broadly about how using passive smartphone sensing for assessing psychopathology. Psychopathology means mental illness or mental disorders. So I don't think for this audience that I need to make the argument of why this would be compelling. It would be nice to be able to naturalistically follow our patients in daily life and be able to understand when they are experiencing clinically significant states. And if we could assess those through something that we all carry around in our pockets, it would be nice to be able to update or inform clinicians of it in real time and fill in those gaps between sessions that you have either for psychotherapy or med checks. However, the literature on this is limited in a variety of ways. I mean, this has been an interesting topic, and there's been a proliferation of literature here. But one of the challenges is that psychiatric diagnoses are hard phenotypes to try and predict. One of the issues is if you look at the broader literature, the literature has all sorts of problems in terms of there's failure to find clear results, so that there have been results where there have been markers from passive sensing that do predict psychopathology, but they tend to be non-replicable. They tend to vary across studies, even focusing on the same phenotype. Sometimes they conflict, where you end up with, for instance, both increased screen time predicts depression as well as decreased screen time predicts depression across different studies and the like. And this sort of follows the typical pattern of new tech in psychiatry. The literature is full of small samples. The median sample size in this area is samples of 59. And if you're predicting complex phenotypes like psychopathology, which I'll talk about in just a second, that's just not sufficient. In addition, it looks a lot like what you would see when I talk about new tech, think about things like candidate genes or fMRI, where the sample sizes are small. They focus on a single diagnosis, compare it to healthy controls, and don't really capture the nuance and complexity of the phenomenon. One issue is that we need better psychiatric phenotypes, and this is what I'm going to really focus on in my talk today. So when it comes to psychiatric phenotypes, if you take diagnoses like major depression, I'll use as the example here, they tend to be highly heterogeneous for the most part. So if you think about the symptoms of depression, that includes mood symptoms, energy symptoms, too little sleep, too much sleep, poor appetite, low motivation. All of these by themselves might have their own signature in something like passive sensing or the like, but they might be creating a jumble when it comes to trying to predict this as the target. The other issue is that diagnoses tend to be highly overlapping. People in the population, it tends to follow the rules of 1/2. So if lifetime, half the people will end up with a psychiatric diagnosis, half of those will end up with 2, half of those will end up with 3, and so forth. Within clinical samples, it's much higher, with sometimes being half a dozen being the modal number. These really are the flip sides of the same coin. In other words, the model for the phenotypes tends not to be very good. And so if you're going to be studying something and trying to predict it, especially with something that's distal, like a passive sensor that is a very concrete sensor marker with a complex psychological phenotype, you want to be able to try and reduce this heterogeneity as much as you can. I'm part of a group that focuses on trying to do this. It's called the high-top hierarchical taxonomy of psychopathology. You won't be able to get all this today. I'm going to focus on this part up here. But basically, one of the things that we do is use quantitative empirical modeling to try and find a more empirically derived structure for psychopathology and use that as our taxonomy. And the focus here is on these, I'm going to talk about these sort of spectra that capture things that cut across diagnoses and sort of the main themes. So the spectra that I'll be focusing on here include internalizing, which is sort of a broad liability towards emotional distress and emotional dysregulation, detachment, or the tendency to be socially withdrawn, antagonism, which is disposition towards conflictual or callous interpersonal behavior, disinhibition, which is deficits in impulse control, thought disorder, which is disturbances in the form, content, or coherence of thought, things think of like psychosis, like schizophrenia, and finally somatoform, which is the tendency to experience and express psychological distress as physical symptoms. We looked at this, the study that we looked at this in is the Iliad study. And yes, our next study is the Odyssey. And one thing that we wanted to do was have a large sample. So we had close to 560 individuals. And we wanted people that we didn't pick for a particular diagnosis. We wanted a sort of a whole jumble of diagnoses for people. And so a large portion of these folks were in treatment. Some folks were previously in treatment, and some folks had never been in treatment to get a wide range. We had them fill out a measure that captures those domains from the high-top model that I just showed you. And then they spent 15 days with EMA as well as passive sensing using the EARS program from Nick Allen out in Oksana Health. So here's what we find. These jellyfish each show us, and the width of their tentacles show us the strength of association between these different domains of psychopathology and the variety of different sensors that we're looking at. So you end up with things like disinhibited people end up with later bedtimes. It actually turns out that like quite a bit across the board, different domains are associated with later bedtime. You find other things like detachment has fewer interactions or fewer locations visited, and the like. But you can see that there's a lot of associations here, and this sort of reflects the kind of thing that has been emerging in the literature that I referred to. But what we did is we then looked at unique associations, controlling for each of these, as well as looking at what the shared variance across all of these domains, sometimes referred to as the P factor or the psychopathology factor. These tend to be, like I said, these things tend to be comorbid, how those were associated with these. And when you do that, what you find, focusing first on the top, is that there's many fewer unique associations. There's relatively few, in fact. There are some interesting ones, like more disinhibited people walk around with a lower maximum charge of their phone. If you have kids that are in the adolescent range, that might ring a bell. They tend to be more disinhibited than adults. You see some here in the detachment folks, you see there's some unique associations like fewer locations visited and the like, more time at home, et cetera. And some interesting ones like antagonism, they have shorter outgoing calls, fewer outgoing calls. They're busy being at odds with other people. But if you look below and look at that thing where the black jellyfish that we're affectionately calling the mind flayer here, what you can see here is there are a lot of shared associations, associations that cut across even these broad domains, suggesting that if there's certain markers that tend to be a better marker of just psychopathology generally, as opposed to any particular domain of psychopathology, let alone diagnoses. So this is just an appeal to all of us to think about what type of phenotype that we're trying to predict and focus on in these things. And this is a particular issue when it comes to psychopathology, but it's also probably the case throughout much of medicine. I mean, for any internal docs here, think about the metabolic syndrome, how you end up with things like dyslipidemia, hypertension, and diabetes or hypoglycemia and the like, all co-varying. Anyway, the paper is out. You can check it out for free on JAMA Network Open. Thanks for coming to the talks. And now we'll all talk about it.
All right, questions? All right, I can start. Lauro, so I see you were working with Nico Bonin, and I suspect if you guys haven't already, maybe it's a next step, but have you looked at the findings in individuals who are preclinical. So obviously they don't have a neurodegenerative disease yet, and they don't have gait complaints.
Well, what we try to do is always get the control side. And for example, I did show some of the studies when we tested participants or patients at home and in the clinic. So we just finished analyzing 15 controls, and they show exactly the same thing. So they do it much better in the clinic. And so for any study, we always try to get, the control side. I know that Nico sometimes wants to get patients that they believe they have the disease, but it hasn't been yet observed, at least not by a doctor. But I think that's as far as we go in those cases.
Is there interest in using these devices longitudinally in like high-risk populations? So for example, we know people with REM sleep behavior disorder are at high likelihood of developing alpha-synucleopathies. So this could be something that potentially shows their likelihood of developing a neurodegenerative disease prior to like loss of sense of smell. Are you guys going to consider using this as a potential digital biomarker for that?
Yes. Now, there is a problem with the sensors, and it's getting better now. And the main issue is battery life, which is better now. But remember, you have to charge your Apple Watch every night. You almost have to do exactly the same thing with these devices. But people forget. So that's one of the main problems. Now, we are testing now some of the sensors that they can go for a week with a single charge. So the compliance is the big problem. Can you have somebody stay with this for a month? We try to test things in ourselves first. And for the week-long studies, I have had to wear them for a week. And at the end of the week, I'm tired. I don't want to wear them any longer. So my feeling is that eventually they will get integrated in the shoes, and then you don't have to worry about that. But then you'll have the biomarker.
We need more mics.
Yes, just a question as to whether one might combine the last two talks, like look for gait, not only with regard to physiological conditions, but to psychological conditions. Because I think you mentioned at the very beginning that you could tell when your son is very depressed and his gait varies. Just a thought. So that might provide a little more specificity than some of these other more subjective criteria. Thank you.
Yeah, I thought that was a really great example that really highlighted for me how much mood and gait are linked with each other. I can see the same in my own daughter. She drags her feet, and the opposite is true too. When they're excited, they literally skip. I don't know what the data look like when people are skipping, but it must look pretty cool. But I do think that this dovetails, because I think that the gait point actually in Lauro's talk dovetails with my talk as well, in the sense that gait is a marker for a broad range of conditions, and not just for one specifically. And although the pattern might be slightly different across different conditions, that is something that he highlighted with Parkinson's, for instance. And I think the one way that this dovetails with my talk is that you can take something that's a general marker, which would seem to be a major limitation in my talk, and it doesn't necessarily mean to be a limitation in the absolute sense. It just means to be contextualized appropriately. So if you have a patient already, tracking things that are general markers of severity are going to be useful. So you already may know their diagnosis, but it would be informative that they are getting more severe if they're not leaving the house or are going to bed later, which are some of the prime markers of more severe. But they are probably not going to be good markers for sort of sentinels for and coming up with specific diagnoses, because they are non-specific. So I think it all comes down to how you want to use them. I don't know if you have additional thoughts.
Well, I am here to sell Gait, so I think Gait is a very good indicator for many things, and probably not for everything, but definitely as I was coming to this talk, I started reading more about Gait and depression, and then I'm finding all these papers, all this information. I'm feeling that I have to do more walking now, so I can, yes.
Hello. So I have a question regarding the CGM use. So I know most of the devices, especially the non-CGM and also including the CGM, like they're not accurate to like 100%. A lot of their efficiency range kind of lies between 8 to 10. And I think that's what is for CGM as well. So when we pull the data or when we get the data for the glucose, is that something accounted in the algorithm? Like,
No, you can't account for that. I mean, you can in the analysis, but I guess to go a little bit deeper into your question, so CGM has a needle that doesn't sit too deep. It sits in the interstitial fluid rather than in your blood glucose. And the glucose in your interstitial fluid will always be delayed compared to your blood glucose. So if you're like in a moment of, let's say, you're type 1 and you decided to drink an orange juice, which you shouldn't do, your glucose is going to spike really fast and your blood glucose will track it, but your interstitial glucose will have a delay. And it's between like 5 and 15 minutes. So those are the things that you can't really correct for. People who wear CGM and use it to make decisions, they're aware of that, so they try to adjust. If you're pulling data across many individuals and you're pulling data across many days, then generally speaking, that measurement error gets so small that is not relevant for the analysis that you are doing. But you should not treat it as gold truth of blood glucose at that time.
Makes sense. Thank you. And so just to follow up to this one, so do you think like the non-CGMs that where we prick our fingers and we get the data, that's actually a blood glucose reading, right?
No, that also has measurement error. If you really want gold standard, you get plasma glucose, and no one does that. You have a limitation. Like, I don't know if you ever tried the finger stick.
I've done both.
So if you tried multiples of them, it's not going to give you the same number. It's going to vary a little bit. So you kind of have to accept that. I would say that with CGM, it gets a little bit more complex because of the interstitial versus blood. And then you have things like pressure attenuations. You have things with some older models that required calibration that if people didn't calibrate, that could be off quite a bit. Some of the devices used to be sensitive to like vitamin C intake or something else. So it's not gold, but I think it's good enough for most cases.
Thank you.
That's really interesting. How much individual variability is there in terms of the measurement? Meaning that, you know, you've got a 5-minute delay, I've got a 15-minute delay or something like that. Is
it on? Yeah. I don't know.
Sorry for
No, I really don't know.
I have a question for Dr. Hertz. So it seems like you have a lot of clinical background. So what do you see a path forward for the neuropathy prediction tool as far as integrating into actual clinical practice?
Yeah, so we're kind of doing a separate project that we hope to merge where what we've found doing a lot of qualitative work with different patients is that there's an under appreciation or recognition that CIPN can be permanent. And we've done a fair amount of qualitative work where had patients known that CIPN could be permanent, they would have made much different treatment decisions in terms of when they stopped, how severe they let it get. So we think there's a really good opportunity to combine these two concepts together where we have patients, we can identify they're having neuropathy. We then educate them about permanent neuropathy. We ask them their preferences for, do they want to have maximized treatment and maximize efficacy? Do they want to have minimal treatment and minimize neuropathy, something in between? And then we really allow for this shared decision-making between them and their clinician to achieve their treatment goals. So that's what we see as like the most obvious sort of first step. We think in the future there will be effective strategies for treatment, effective strategies for prevention, all these different things. So there could be different ways that it can be used, but we often get that question is, why do you need to identify this if there's nothing you can do about it? And we think that shared decision-making model is one potential option that we could do kind of right now.
I had a question for Dr. Wright. So the last jellyfish graph, if you want to refer to that, for the thought disorder kind of category, it didn't seem like anything connected down into the Sankey. Can you explain that? Is that an error on the display or?
No, that was rendering correctly. We found no unique associations. So the associations that we found with the thought disorder spectrum were all general. They tended to be things like lower mobility, lower exercise, spending more time at home, and later bedtime. Later bedtime was an effect that we found for everything. And if you find an effect for each one of these domains and then control for them all, you find that it's only a general domain. So that just as an example, but that's an interesting one because there are studies looking at this in thought disorder. And my concern is that we end up with this very fragmented literature that says, oh, here are the markers for this disorder, here's the markers for this diagnosis, et cetera. And we don't know, well, what just is a general marker of severity and what is a marker that might tell us this person has this and not that.